it's Lori again, and welcome back to my kitchen. There has been such an increased interest in home canning in just the last few years that I would like to kind of do an introduction to canning for those who maybe never had older family members that canned in their home. They were never taught how to can. This is the first time that they're ever going to be canning on their own. I'd like to do a few introductory videos. Today, I'd like to cover just the very, very first thing that most everybody begins with, which is hot water bathing. So I would like to go over some of the things that you will need to start your canning journey. And honestly, there's not a whole lot that you actually absolutely have to have. You obviously need to have jars. And another thing that you really need to have, and it doesn't cost very much, this is a jar lifter. And this just allows you to reach into that very hot water with the jar lifter and safely retrieve your jars. So that's a really necessary tool. And this is really one of the only necessary tools as far as I'm concerned, but you pretty much got to have one of these, all right? Another thing that makes canning a lot easier is having a funnel. And it just, obviously, it's self-explanatory. You put it in the jar and it kind of helps you get the food into your jar a little bit easier. So these are very, very handy to have, and these also are very inexpensive. Now, as far as your jars are concerned, you can go out and you can purchase canning jars, brand new. I do also want to say that you can find used jars, and used jars are as good and sometimes even better because you can find older jars that are heavier and better quality. But you can find used jars at thrift stores and garage sales and auctions, and don't ever second think about buying used jars because they are as good, if not better, as brand new unused jars. And yes, canning jars can be reused time and time again, okay? So the one thing that you do want to look for if you are buying used canning jars is obviously inspect your jars and make sure that there are no cracks that you can see or chips that you can see. And another really important thing is take your finger and run them right around the very top rim of the jar. Make sure it's nice and smooth and there's no chips in it. Some of the older jars do get a little rough, and I can guarantee you, even though the jar is in good shape, if the rim of the jar is rough in any way, you're not going to achieve a good seal. So I would avoid those or purchase those jars for dry storage, like flour or sugar or pasta or beans or rice. Canning jars are really good for a lot more things than just heat canning. But anyway, so new or used, always inspect your jars. Inspect to make sure that there's no cracks in them, and inspect that rim to make sure that it is nice and smooth. You obviously probably know that you can buy jars in quart size, in pint size, in half pints. There's all sorts of different sizes of jars. That's in regular canning jars. Now, another thing is that if you do not have the money, or you don't want to invest in a whole bunch of, going out and buying a whole bunch of canning jars, you can reuse product jars from your grocery store. And specifically, the one piece lid, this is called a lug lid, and these type of lids come on a lot of different products from your grocery store. Spaghetti sauce and marinara sauce, and sauerkraut comes in, pickles come in these, sometimes the smaller jars of mushrooms. You know the type of jars that I'm talking about, but they have these single piece lug lids, all right? And I'll get it kind of closer to the camera here, hopefully, so that you can see. And on the inside of these lug lids, there's this nice bead of silicone sealant, okay? These are the type of lids that can be reused, but they have to be used on the jar that they were purchased with, all right? So unlike your canning jars where, your screw-on bands can go on any jar and your flat lid can go on any jar of the same size, some of these product jars are very specific on the size of lug lid. So when I'm reusing product jars, I always make sure after I've washed them up to store the actual lid that came on the jar with the actual jar, all right? So that I know I have the proper lid for the proper jar. Now, when we're talking flat lids, all right, you go out and you buy your flat lids and, you know, your screw-on bands. Now, if you've purchased brand new jars, they usually come with the screw-on band and flat lids with them. Whenever you buy jars, obviously, brand new ones or used, please wash them up well. Always wash your jars up well. When you go and you buy your canning flats and rings, wash those up too. Even your brand new in the box flats, always wash them in hot soapy water. Don't put them in your dishwasher. You gotta wash them by hand. But wash them up because there's oils and things from the manufacturing process that really should be washed off. So make sure that you always wash up your brand new flat lids. When tightening jars, okay, the rule of thumb when tightening a canning jar is after you put your food into your jar, you always take a clean wet washcloth and wipe off the rim of the jar just to make sure that you don't have any food particles on the rim of the jar. You take your clean flat end ring and place that on the jar and then just simply line up the threads. I'm having difficulties doing that right now. Line up the threads and just screw it on fingertip tight. And as you can see, I use 1, 2, 3 and my thumb and just fingertip tight, okay? You don't ever want to take your whole hand, palm of the hand, wrist action and everything. You don't want to crank them down that tight. You just want them fingertip tight, all right? And that's all the tighter you want them. Don't overthink it. Just put them on there, fingertip tight, and into the canner they go, all right? Now, with the product jars, it's even more simple because what you do is you take this one-piece lug lid and you just screw it on until it doesn't screw anymore, okay? There is no over-tightening these. There is no trick to it. You just turn them. They turn usually about approximately a quarter of a turn, and they're locked on. And that's all it takes for the product jars. Now, the whole concept of heat canning is number one priority is always look at canning charts that are founded in good canning practices, all right? You will find canning charts, canning times in all sorts of books and online, whatever. Just always find the canning charts with the appropriate times because the whole point of heat canning is to heat your food inside of the jar for long enough to destroy all harmful bacteria and toxins, okay? So canning is not about just getting that lid to seal, all right? Because you can get a lid to seal very, very easily. And I'll explain what open kettle canning is, but open kettle canning, I'll do that at a later date. But open kettle canning is just simply pouring a hot product into a jar and placing a lid in a ring. And as it cools, that lid will seal. And that's okay to do with certain things. But the list of items that are safe to do that with is a very small list. And it's always high acid food or high sugar food. So your jams, your jellies, your pickles, okay, those are safe to open kettle can. But the point is that it's very simple to get a canning lid to seal. And in heat processing or heat canning your food, the whole point of heat canning is to heat that food for a long enough time at a high enough temperature to destroy all the harmful germs in there. So always follow good canning time charts, okay? Now, as far as hot water bath is concerned, I'm going to page down a little bit. You can see that I have my old hot water bath canner here today. And I'm sure that all of you have seen one like this before. So a hot water bath canner comes with a rack inside that you place your jars in. And that is a really, really important thing, okay? The reason why there's always a rack in a canner is because it lifts the jars up off of the bottom of your canner and it protects them from the direct heat of your burner or your stove, okay? That's super important because if those jars are directly on the bottom of your canner or a pot, the direct heat can break your jars, okay? So it's always important to have something underneath your jars inside your canner. And water bath canners, usually standard, they come with that rack in there. Always use your rack, okay, to place your jars in. Now, a water bath canner is not the only way that you can hot water bath food. I'm going to just move this over here. So if you don't have a water bath canner, or if you don't have the money to invest in one right now, but you really want to start canning, if you have a large pot, a large stock pot, any sort of large tall pot, you can water bath can in it, okay? So you don't have to have any fancy equipment. You can use just a regular pot. The only thing is that you need to have that pot tall enough or deep enough that when you put your jars of food inside of it, that the water covers them by 2 inches. Your jars need to be completely submerged under 2 inches of water, okay? So that's the only rule of thumb. Now, you look at my stock pot and you go, but Lori, you don't have a rack in there. You can't put your jars on the bottom of the pan. Well, you're very, very right. And I don't have a rack that fits in there. But if you do, if you have some sort of a trave that you could set down in there, use your trave. If you have one of those cookie cooling racks, you know, they make them in all sorts of sizes and shapes. But if you have a round cookie rack that would fit down in your pot, you use that. Or you can just use a thick towel in the bottom of your pan, okay? So just take a thick towel and place that down in your pot, and then you can set your canning jars in on top of that towel. And that towel will act just like the rack does. It will protect your jars from that direct heat. So yeah, your towel is going to get absolutely soaking wet. Not a problem. It'll dry, right? But it will protect your jars from that direct heat. So very simple. If you have a pot and a towel and jars, you can start canning. Now, the other main thing that I will, I guess, explain to you. When you're canning, there is something that is called thermal shock. What thermal shock is it's when your jars break because there's been such a drastic change between hot and cold. So if you are canning something from a cold state, let's say you're canning peaches, or you're canning raw potatoes and they're just at room temperature, all right? If your food item in your jar is at room temperature, you want to start with room temperature water in your canner. You don't want to start with a hot canner because your peaches might be really nice and cool because your room is, but when you put them down into that hot boiling water, your jar is going to go snap. I can't take this, and it's going to break. The bottom's going to break right out of it. You're going to have to clean your canner. You're going to lose your peaches. Not good stuff. So if you're starting with a cool food product, start with cool canning water. If you are making a soup and you've cooked it on your stove and you want to can it up, if you're starting with hot food, you start with hot canning water. So match the temperature between your jars and food and the temperature of your canning water. Let's see. Can you double stack in a hot water bath? Yes. Yes, you can. And how you would do that is, I'm going to aim down just a little bit more. If you can fit a double stack of, let's say, pint jars in your canner. Let's say my pot was tall enough that I can stack them and have that top layer still underneath 2 inches of water. If my pot was tall enough to do that, what I would want to do is I would either want to, I'd place a rack or towel on the bottom of the canner. Actually, I'll do this. Place something on the bottom of, oops, knocking stuff over here, guys. Place something on the bottom of your canner to protect your jars on the bottom layer. And then if you had a rack, you'd place a rack over the top of them and then set your other layer of jars on top. Now, if you don't have a rack that can go on top of these, what you can do is you can put another layer of towel on top of your entire bottom layer of jars, but do not stack directly on top of each other, okay? What you want to do is you want to stagger them in between the seams of the other jars, all the way around your canner. Make sure that they're staggered in between, not over the top. So yes, you can double stack in a hot water bath as long as you have a deep enough vessel that you are hot water bathing in. Okay, so another good tip that I can tell you is, after you have found a reputable canning chart with the appropriate times for your food items, when you start timing your process time, it's not just the minute that you get your jars into your canner. What you want to do is you want to heat your water up to a complete full rolling boil. Now remember, your jars have to be underneath 2 inches of water. Heat your water up to a full rolling boil. When your water comes to a full rolling boil, that is the point that you want to start your process timer, okay? So do not time it until that water is boiling. Now, with most high acid foods, fruit juice, jams, jellies, tomatoes, those are all high acid foods. High acid foods are generally canned for a shorter amount of time. Approximately 30 minutes for tomatoes, and it's shorter times for fruits and for jams and jellies. So you don't have to worry about ever replenishing your water doing that. But if you are going to hot water bath low acid foods, anything with meat or vegetables in it, or even like broths, any low acid food requires a lot longer canning times in a hot water bath. And in that period of time, you're boiling that water for hours on end, okay? Meat times are 3 hours of hot water bathing, okay? In 3 hours, you know you're gonna have water evaporating out of your hot water bath canner. Use a lid if you have one, okay? That will slow down the evaporation. And on your canner, use your lid on your water bath canner too. So the lid will slow down the evaporation, but it will not stop it completely. So in extremely long water bath times, like 2 hours, 3 hour times, what you need to do is you need to have either pots or tea kettles full of water and heating. Have it hot at all times so that when your water level does start to go down a little bit and evaporate off in your hot water canner, you can re-add more boiling water to it. Now, you don't want to add tap water, you don't want to add cold water, because what that will do, that will cool off your entire canning process and interfere with that heat penetration into the food. Now, remember when I said that you need to have the appropriate heat for long enough to kill all of those bacteria and germs and things like that. You don't want to cool off your hot water bath process at all. So only add boiling water if you need to because of the evaporation. And in a 3 hour hot water bath, you will need to add water. So have boiling water ready at all times to add. And then just so that you can see here, I'm going to tip down just a little bit. At the end of your hot water bath process, let's say that you've water bath tomatoes for 30 minutes. Turn off your heat and allow your jars to remain inside of your canner for at least 5 or 10 minutes. Just leave them in there to cool off just ever so slightly. If you immediately remove those into the cool room air, you can have siphoning, okay? The difference between the hot boiling environment it was in coming into a very, very cool room, it causes those items or products inside of your jar to kind of heave up and push out of the jar underneath the lid. And so you don't want that to happen. Plus, it's really dangerous because you can get scorched or burnt. So after your hot water bath process, allow your canner or your pot to cool off with the jars remaining in there for at least 5 or 10 minutes before you remove them. And then when you remove them, you want to have a thick towel on your countertop because your countertop is cold. You know, it's at room temperature. If you put a jar that's at 112 degrees on this cold countertop, we're going to get thermal shock. We're going to break our jar, okay? So always bring your hot jars to rest on a thick towel on your counter. Now, this is where this tool comes in, really handy, okay? Let's pretend this jar is inside my canner, and I've allowed it to rest for that 10 minutes after I turned off the heat. This is that jar lifter that I was saying that you really need to have. And I don't want you to ever pick up these jars by this screw-on band, okay? On all of your jars, there's this glass lip. Underneath this screw-on band, there's a glass lip. And you want to get your jar lifter underneath that glass lip so that you are not grabbing onto that screw-on band at all. All right, so make sure that when you're lifting your jars out, you're lifting them at the appropriate place to lift them. And the same thing with your product jars. Now your product jars have that little lip too. Make sure that you get underneath that little glass lip when you're lifting them. You don't ever want to lift by those lids or those single piece lids or the screw-on bands. You just don't want to touch them. Now after you have taken out all of your beautiful home canned goods and you've put them on the towel and you're waiting to hear that wonderful noise of the jars sealing. Number one, not all lids these days make the ping noise or the snap or pop noise. You might not hear anything at all right? So don't get disappointed and don't get worried if you don't hear that noise because some of the lids just don't do it. Like these lids don't have that little pop-up button. Like this one kind of has a little pop-up button here. These lids don't have the pop-up button, and so they really don't make that much of a noise when they seal. But after removing your jars from the canner, allow them to sit for at least 12 to 15 hours without touching them at all. Do not tighten any of your bands. Don't come over and press on them. Just no touchy. Come out of the canner, onto the towel, and leave them alone for 12 to 15 hours, okay? And at that point in time, after 12 or 15 hours, you should be able to tell whether it is sealed or not. Now, if you have some jars that do not seal, you can, within 24 hours, I'm going to tip you back up here. Within a 24-hour window, if you have something that came out of the canner and it didn't seal, you have a 24-hour window to be able to reprocess that jar again. Just what I would do is generally I open them up, I re-wipe the rim, okay? Check your headspace. Maybe your headspace was just not enough headspace. So if you think you have, if that was the problem, you didn't have enough headspace in there, you could take 1 or 2 teaspoons of the food out of there, re-wipe the lid, and put a clean, fresh, flat lid and ring back on, and you can go ahead and reprocess that jar for the same amount of time that you did the first time. Every time you expose the food to the room air, it is recontaminated, okay? So it needs to be completely reprocessed at the same time as if you were starting over from scratch or with raw food, okay? So reprocessing your food is at the same exact time as what you did the first time you processed it. Let's see if I can think of anything else. Oh, some people have hard water with calcium, lime, whatever in it. And in your canner, that calcium and lime can kind of corrode up the outside of your jars. You get like this white, foggy stuff on the outside of your jars. To prevent that from happening, in a hot water bath, I still use vinegar. Just put a little splash of vinegar in your hot water bath water inside the canner, and that will help prevent some of those hard water deposits from being on your jars. Now, I don't use vinegar in any of my pressure canners anymore. I only use cream of tartar because vinegar in a pressure canner is very, very corrosive to, in a pressure canner, it's a lot hotter environment than in a hot water bath. But it's very, very corrosive to today's lids and rings. And so in my pressure canners, I only use cream of tartar. In my hot water bath, I still use vinegar. You can use cream of tartar in your hot water bath if you want to, but vinegar works just as well. And for some reason, there's just a difference of having your jars submerged underneath the water. It doesn't corrode the rings quite as badly as what it does in a pressure canner where they're not submerged. Let's see. I think that is the ABCs of hot water bathing. So I hope that you found this information useful. Like I said, you don't have to have any fancy canning equipment. The only thing that you really need is a deep enough pot. And you can even use product jars. You don't have to go out and buy canning jars to get started. Canning jars are very convenient, and particularly when you're talking about like the wide mouth canning jars, I guess I didn't touch on that. There is regular mouth and then there is wide mouth. And the difference being that the wide mouth are a little bit easier to pack. Now, I love my regular mouth canning jars for a lot of things. I do fruit juices. I do jams and jellies in these. I do soups and broths in these. I do a lot of things in these. The reason why I like my wide mouth jars particularly is when I'm canning meat. Bone-in chicken, it fits in here and it comes out a lot easier. Just regular meat packs, it's just easier to get things out when it's a real solid pack. And so that's why I like my wide mouth jars for those type of items. But I have so many regular mouth jars and I use them always, always, always. So it's just a preference thing. There is no difference in function as far as wide mouth and regular mouth are concerned. It's just literally a packing and unpacking preference for all of us. So I think I've covered all the bases. So I hope you found it useful. I hope maybe it simplified it a little bit so that you can start canning in your own home and get started as soon as possible. Thank you for spending your time with me again today. God bless you all and happy canning, everybody.